Things can get messy very quickly. That's Gareth Soloway's latest warning about Bitcoin because it hasn't been moving for a while. When that happens in a risk asset, it means there's a lack of liquidity. So if all of a sudden any news or a big player comes to the market, we can see huge moves in either direction. So watch what Gareth has to say about this now.
Crypto, again, as dead as can be, but it's still in this range. And the key to Bitcoin, guys, is that here's your resistance, here's your support. If the support breaks, watch out. Then things get very messy very quickly. If this area breaks and we stay above it, and again, this here it broke and it reversed. So you really want to see a couple days above it. If that happens, this thing's off to the races. Bitcoin volume right now is so low that I do worry that it's setting up for a huge move. The volatility and disinterest in crypto right now, especially Bitcoin with the lack of volatility, is massive right now. Just people not caring. Such tiny volume. What that does is it makes vulnerable very big swings in charts. So be ready that if you do crack this, there's going to be a lot of stops and a lot of people shorting, and it could flush. I mean, you could flush literally, you could dump here and you could go to 25,000 in a split second, right through it. That would not surprise me. On the upside, by the way, if you break out, you could go to 30, 35, 36,000 very, very quickly.
And 2 days ago, in another interview, Gareth explained clearly why he believes this can happen at any moment now.
Yeah, so I mean, my issue is this, right? And listen, I'm a huge fan of Bitcoin and I actually continue to become a greater fan of Bitcoin in the longer term because, again, what I've loved seeing in Bitcoin is that every time we have a Moody's downgrade of banks, Fitch downgrades the U.S. credit rating, or we even saw back in March some banks failing, we saw Bitcoin popping up. So it's establishing itself as this safety hedge when the banking sector starts to have trouble. Now, my only negative is, and this is why I'm kind of intrigued by what we end up seeing in the crypto markets, is that what happens if we go into a recession where we have de-risking and multiples coming in? So essentially risk assets just selling off across the board. And my fear, unfortunately, is that we could end up seeing Bitcoin coming down with the equity market. So if we look at the NASDAQ, so I have the QQQ on one side of my screen and we have Bitcoin on the other, and I'm just going to remove these lines so it keeps it as simple as possible for us. But look at how far we are from the all-time highs on Bitcoin, and look at how far we are from the all-time highs on the NASDAQ. So essentially the NASDAQ retraced about 80% of its drop. Bitcoin's only retraced about 30%. And so the thought process is this: what if, just hypothetically, we go into a recession and we see the NASDAQ go back to the October 2022 lows? What happens to Bitcoin? I mean, you can't tell me that if the NASDAQ drops all the way back down here, we're not going to see at least Bitcoin retesting that 15,000 level or so. And I even think it could potentially go lower. So I think if we got a credit event, that's a different story. But if it's your run-of-the-mill recession, then you're probably seeing Bitcoin hit the lows again before going substantially higher.
But this time, there's a divergence between Bitcoin and the NASDAQ.
In that if you had told me prior that the NASDAQ was going to go back up 40% from where it was in October of 2022, if I didn't know, I would say, wow, Bitcoin could be at 60, 70, 1,000 at that point because of such a run in risk assets. That hasn't happened. And I think part of that is this overhang of securities law or the SEC trying to figure itself out or what they want to impose on the crypto markets. That's made people just stand back. We know that the Ripple decision went in Ripple's, in their favor from the judge, but now there's an appeals process that's like 2 years out, and that's just going to kill the altcoin market for another couple years, most likely. So I think there's part of that, and then I also think that there's just this waiting on the Bitcoin ETF. Is it going to be approved? Is it not going to be approved?
What would be needed for prices to change and start moving then?
An ETF, a spot ETF would be a big event. I did hear that the ARK Invest spot ETF got delayed, so it didn't get rejected, but it got delayed, so there's no new news there. Bitcoin did downtick a little bit on that news, but nothing major. And then really you're just watching for these credit events. And I think the biggest thing to watch for as a Bitcoin investor, watch the yields, right? So watch the 10-year. Do we start to break out above, let's say, 3.3% on the 10-year, which was, by the way, the high in October when the markets bottomed, yields topped. And so if you saw us take out 3.3, does that then put more pressure on treasuries and the selling of bonds by the U.S., which we have to sell, so many to kind of, fund what we're doing as a country? Remember, $1 trillion in interest alone now about on the U.S. debt. It's atrocious.
Also, we know the halving is coming. What are Gareth's predictions for the halving and the end of this year?
Not only about the recession, but have we ever had a halving where the Fed has tightened aggressively and is not, not lowering interest rates and printing money and quantitative easing? And that's another thing. So what concerns me, and this is more an anecdotal thing, kind of where I look at what everyone's saying, and if you go on Crypto X or if you go anywhere else, what you hear is, hey, just buy Bitcoin now because you'll make a fortune when the halving happens. And I've been a trader for 25 years, and anytime I've ever thought that way, I've always lost. And so, it's when you expect something and it's so easy, oftentimes you're disappointed. And I would just caution people is that it doesn't usually work out that way when everyone expects it to be such. For Bitcoin, I think you're probably back towards 20,000. You some sort of flush out here to kind of make people question right now that you got so many bulls out there. So I would say more towards the downside target of that. And then again, I think you ask me 3 years out, it's way, way higher. And 5 years out, even higher than that, as I think, again, it does start to take on that safety trade as it gets accepted by institutions and invested by pension funds as well.
Leave your thoughts in the comments below and watch this video next. It may help you make better investment decisions until the end of 2023.